And started off at number 10, we have Archimonde's Hatred Reborn. This was a tank-only legendary trinket that when used would put a shield on you for 30% of your maximum HP for 10 seconds. And when that shield broke or expired, 75% of the damage taken at the time was dealt to all nearby enemies. On its own, that doesn't sound like a lot, but this was during Legion, where your average tank had well over 11 million HP in the endgame content. This one trinket turned average tanks that had to just pray a healer could take care of them into downright monsters. Being on only a 1 minute and 15 second cooldown, it let tanks like Protection Warriors and Vengeance Demon Hunters absolutely dominate dungeons and raid fights by having it up for every raid-wide mechanic, or even new packs of enemies in dungeons. Especially when most tanks did not have the ability to sustain themselves like Blood Death Knights. This was a must-have during emergencies and during the beginning of pulls in dungeons to ensure you didn't meet an untimely demise to biting off more than you could chew, especially when pulling enemies due to you not being able to use a defensive ability until after combat was started. In fact, this was partially why people considered Legion the golden age for Protection Warriors. Being able to solo dungeons was definitely helped by this trinket. However, due to it losing value on other tanks like Brewmaster Monk and Protection Paladin, which respectively damaged themselves quite heavily or relied on blocking damage outright instead of taking it, this trinket only ends up at number 10 on this list.
Oh no, I seem to be lost in these woods. I hope no one tries to sell me product.
Hello there, are you interested in eating healthy but hate cooking?
Oh thank goodness. Can you tell me how to get back to the main road?
No can do, but I can tell you about how Factor takes the stress out of meal planning and sets you up for success. Skip the grocery stores, prep work, and cooking fatigue. Instead, get chef-crafted, dietitian-approved meals delivered right to your door. With over 35 meals to choose from per week, including options like keto, calorie smart, vegan plus veggie, and more.
I just want to get home.
Factor now offers loads to snack options like breakfast, smoothies, juices, small bites, and more to keep going no matter what's on the schedule. I recently started a new diet plan because I was looking more transparent than normal, and I hate cooking. So this was the best way to eat healthier and actually stick to it.
I was out here to bury a body.
Support the channel by clicking my link and subscribing to Factor. Every purchase helps me create more awesome content for you. And at number 9, we have the Marquee Bindings of the Sun King. This legendary was used by fire mages only and made it so after consuming Hot Streak, there was a 15% chance that you would gain a buff that would cause your next non-instant cast Pyro Blast within 15 seconds to deal 300% increased damage. Hot Streak, for reference, was a buff which is applied when you critically strike 2 times in a row, causing your next Pyroblast or Flame Strike to be instant cast. This legendary was so potentially powerful when it activated that it made fire mages one of the best DPS in the game in most single target fights if the stars decided to align. This was all because the 300% damage Pyroblast could also critically strike, causing it to become a 600% damage Pyroblast instead, which was also half of a new Hot Streak, thus letting you chain multiple Hot Streaks that all had a chance to proc this more and more. The main cooldown of Fire Mage's Combustion allowed you to almost guarantee that chain by causing guaranteed critical strikes for 10 seconds, as well as granting mastery equal to 50% of your crit strike at the time, which combined all the damage you dealt into a damage over time dot called Ignite, potentially even doubling the damage you would end up dealing. With enough luck, you could hit multiples of these in a row, causing your damage to cascade into unreasonable levels. Unfortunately, it would end up losing value in dungeons when chain pulling did not let you have time to ramp up your damage, as well as most pulls being well over 10 enemies when this is almost purely single target damage, which is why this legendary is not higher on the list, especially considering what we're going to be covering later for mages. And at number 8, we have the Soul Rings. Now, each class has their own ring that corresponds to their class hall title. Warriors had Soul of the Battlelord, Paladins had Soul of the High Lord, Demon Hunters had Soul of the Slayer, and so on and so on. These rings would give your character an extra talent depending on the class and specialization you were. At the time of Legion, you were still using the old talent system, that being 7 rows with 3 choices, meaning this extra talent had a lot more value than what it may seem, especially now with the updated talent trees with upwards of 80 options instead of the previous 21. A lot of these range from generally useful to entire game changers for a lot of classes. For example, the Warrior ring for the Fury specialization caused you to gain the talent Massacre, which at the time made it so your execute critical strikes reduced the rage cost of your next rampage by 100%. This, in conjunction with the legendary Valajar Berserker, which made it so your rampage critical strikes against your primary target generated 6 rage, allowed you to combo execute and rampage almost infinitely once it reached the execute phase. This allowed Fury Warriors to go from an average DPS to one of the best in the world. Another notable user of this version of this legendary was Affliction Warlock, which gained their talent Soul Conduit, giving every soul shard they spent a 20% chance to be instantly refunded. But the best part wasn't how strong it was that it allowed them to take the other talent in the row, that being Death's Embrace. This made it so that all of their main damage dealing abilities would deal up to 50% increased damage against targets below 35% HP. The lower the enemy's HP below 35%, the higher the buff, giving Affliction Warlocks a very strong option for 100% of the content that they were doing, or even for every Paladin specialization, which for Holy Retribution gained a Divine Purpose, made it so that every time they spent Holy Power, it had a chance to make the next Holy Power spender free and do more damage and healing, which could chain for free casts. While for protection, they just gained a flat 15% block chance from the talent Holy Shield that also allowed you to block spells, and even did damage back to the enemies that you blocked. The general lack of downsides made it almost always a very good option. So these legendaries ended up being some of the best in the game by far. And at number 7, we have Aman'thul's Wisdom. This was a Restoration Druid legendary that made it so when your main heal over time, Rejuvenation, healed a target that was already at full health, the duration would extend by 3 seconds, up to a maximum of 9 seconds per cast. Druids were already an incredibly strong raid healer, but this legendary sent them over the top very quickly when it was first introduced. This was because around 70% of the Restoration Druid's kit and talents revolved around Rejuvenation. For example, the talent Abundance, which at the time made it so that each Rejuvenation active would reduce the cast time of the spell Healing Touch, as well as increase the critical chance of the spell regrowth. This legendary made this talent much more effective by keeping Rejuvenation active much longer than it would normally be, allowing you to have access to Abundance benefits for much longer than normal. Another one is the talent Germination, which made it so you could have 2 Rejuvenations active on the same target at once. And lastly, we had the talent Flourish, which increased the duration of all heal over time effects on friendly targets by 6 seconds. In conjunction with the legendary effect, made it so Rejuvenation could have a duration of upwards of 30 seconds, which meant you could, with enough effort, have 1 to 2 on every single person in your raid all of the time. This legendary gave such an immense amount of value if the conditions were right, and let Restoration Druids sit on the throne of best raid healer for roughly the entire expansion, as well as being a very strong option for dungeon heal with Germination, allowing you to keep your party alive with relative ease. But even that only lands in the number 7 spot, since it can fall off if the damage from a fight is too much for you to get value out of it due to it needing to heal a full health target. And at number 6, we have the Emperor's Capacitor. This was a monk legendary that made it so that every time you spent your main generating resource, Chi, it would increase the damage of your next Crackling Jade Lightning by 100% and reduce its cost by 5%, stacking up to 20 times. Crackling Jade Lightning was a very weak range attack that every monk specialization got, which was not very useful unless it was to pull aggro as a Brewmaster monk. This legendary turned that idea on its head by making it your highest damage ability by far. A 2000 damage increase at full stacks to any ability would be unfair, but to a range ability as well as making it free by reducing the cost down by 100% so it spends no energy, meaning you did not have any downtime due to bad resource generation, this made it downright an unfair combo, letting you have a cooldown period if you needed one, since haste was easily the worst stat for Windwalker monks at the time. And I haven't even mentioned how it functioned with Windwalker Monk Mastery, which made it so whenever you use an ability that isn't the same as the previous one, it would do more damage, which ended up scaling the damage through the roof due to it being a multiplicative rather than an additive bonus. This was easily also the most taken legendary by Windwalker monks in raids and dungeons, giving a massive burst window for quite literally 0 effort. So even outside of cooldowns, you would always do a lot of damage. As well as when combined with legendaries such as the Wind Blows, monks were extremely strong in PvE content all the way until the end of the expansion without much effort at all due to the simplicity of the specialization. And at number 5, we have the Mantle, the Master Assassin. This was a rogue-only legendary that made it so that while you were stealth, and for 6 seconds after breaking stealth, you had a 100% chance to critically strike. This changed the entire playstyle for rogues the entire expansion and allowed them to be excessively strong in PvE and PvP. This was because there were several abilities rogues had, like Shadow Dance or Vanish, to force this to go off multiple times in succession, giving them a 100% chance to crit with 0 effort. Couple that with legendaries like Zoldyck Family Training Shackles for assassination rogues, it allowed you to burn people and mobs down in just a few seconds during your cooldowns, as your damage would only get higher the lower the enemy's HP would go. Or with specializations like Outlaw, where the main combo point spender, Between the Eyes, would deal 4 times damage on crits rather than the standard double damage, which was a very strong burst combo that not a lot of people could handle in PvP or in PvE, as they would simply delete packs of enemies in dungeons by using it along with their ability Blade Flurry, which in Legion did not have a target cap, as well as worked with the legendary insignia of Ravenhold, which gave another strong cleave passive, which would also guarantee a crit. And that's not even including the talent assassination rogues and subtlety rogues had called Night Stalker, which gave a 50% increase to damage while in stealth. And subtlety also had another talent like Master of Subtlety and Dark Shadow, adding to the stealth damage bonuses even further. This legendary was essentially a gift from Blizzard to rogues, saying go have fun. Its simplicity made it very strong and a requirement for every single rogue trying to reach the best the class could do. Since if you could maintain proper uptime of stealth, you could crit well over 70% of the time in a raid fight that lasts over 4 minutes, as well as making it downright oppressive in PvP content for any class that had no immunity. And at number 4, we have Prydaz Xavaric Magnum Opus. Usable by all classes, this necklace gave a 30% shield to the wearer based on their max HP, refreshing every 30 seconds. Now, considering earlier on this list we had Archimonde's Hatred Reborn, this is almost strictly a direct upgrade, especially because every class and specialization could use it, and most of the mechanics in WoW tend to do just enough damage to kill you. This essentially granted you a permanent defensive active at all times, allowing you to survive things that you normally wouldn't be able to, or simply give your healers an easier time, allowing fights to be much smoother when raiding or doing dungeons. And for tanks and dungeons, it was a must-have, since it meant the healers didn't have to worry about you as much, letting them focus on keeping themselves and their DPS alive, especially when combined with Archimonde's Hatred Reborn, since you could wear 2 legendaries at once, having 2 shields worth 30% of your max HP. Even the worst sustained tanks at the time now had tools to hold their own without the need for a healer. In most raid fights during progression, this was the most used legendary by all classes except for healers and a set few, just because of the pure utility it offered in order to get further into a fight that did considerable damage. On top of this, it was also a very good stat stick, giving 3 stats instead of 2, that being Critical Strike, Haste, and Mastery, which only a few legendaries gave at the time. It did end up getting nerfed quite heavily in patch 7.1.5 unfortunately, with a legendary bonus for tanks being cut in half, and it losing 5% of its 30 bonus for healers and damage dealers. But even then, it ended up being taken to several endgame fights in the last patch after the nerf, even in PvP since the scaling was the exact same, sometimes turning a close fight into a win with good timing. It ended up being so strong it made players angry that they had to use it over other legendaries that would give damage, which only proves how strong it really was. And at number 3, we have Mangaza's Madness. This was a Shadow Priest only legendary that would give them an extra use of their main damaging cast, Mind Blast, which generated their new main resource, Insanity. Now, from just a surface level view, this probably seems like it has no right being on this list, but that's only if you consider it from the viewpoint of just being an extra charge of Mind Blast. In reality, this legendary item was the entire reason that Shadow Priests dominated the damage meters from the beginning of expansion all the way until the end of the expansion. And that all had to do with their brand new spell called Surrender to Madness. This was a new spell added in Legion that activated Shadow Priest's newly added Void form, which also granted them a 200% increase to damage before it was nerfed to 150%, which lasted until you stopped using Void form. The main downside of this is that if you ever did drop out of Void form, you would instantly die. Horribly. It was a very hard spell to use, but it had the most damage potential in the game, and that was of course until players discovered Mangaza's Madness, which was able to let them sustain their Void form indefinitely, turning Shadow Priest from a gambling class or a mediocre class into the strongest damage dealer in the game for raid fights. This legendary item was the sole reason that Shadow Priest completely dominated fights and turned the Emerald Nightmare raid into a one-day ordeal, being cleared in 18 hours, which was a trend that continued all the way throughout the expansion on every damage log or raid race. Shadow Priest was consistently at the top throughout without any signs of getting weaker, which was quite irritating for a lot of players since they seemed like an insurmountable wall that just could not be overcome by any amount of skill. Without this legendary item, there's a good chance this never would have happened, especially since it worked extremely well with the other talents such as Shadowy Insight, which made their main damage over time, Shadow Word Pain, have a chance to reset the cooldown of Mind Blast and make it an instant cast. Or Mindbender, which generated a lot of insanity naturally, letting you recharge your Mind Blast to then maintain your Void form without any effort. Most people wouldn't say this legendary itself is strong, but it's the main contributor to Shadow Priest sitting on the throne of the best raid damage dealer for an entire expansion, which is why it's holding the number 3 spot on this list. And at number 2, we have Shard of the Exodar. Its legendary ring was usable by all mage specializations and made its Legend Bloodlust ability called Time Warp or any other form of Bloodlust would not cause you to gain temporal displacement or other debuffs of the same effect, which would make you unable to benefit from Bloodlust or identical effects for 10 minutes. Now, that was a very long-winded way to say that you could cast Bloodlust every 5 minutes instead of every 10 minutes, and any other mages in your group or raid also gain that benefit. This legendary was honestly absurd for every form of content besides PvP. While the Marquee bindings of the Sun King were RNG based and required a lot of luck to be good, this item just made you and every other mage around you much stronger, especially with mythic dungeon keystones being added in Legion, which were timed dungeons that required a lot of coordination and planning, most importantly around your 10-minute cooldown that could change the outcome of many important parts of the dungeon. This would negate the need for that and force a very aggressive playstyle where this raid cooldown could become a regular cooldown for mages, allowing you to use it on average large pack pools and every single boss in a dungeon without needing to worry about saving it for difficult fights. It was extremely strong as well in raid fights due to the average fight length being around 6 minutes. Mages got twice as many bloodlusts on average and would do very high damage due to their burst window basically being built around the 30% increase to haste it gave. This item ended up being such a staple for mages that it was eventually added back in multiple forms. First in Shadowlands for arcane mages, and then a capstone talent for all mages in Dragonflight with the updated talent trees, before eventually being removed in the most recent expansion for being quite expectedly very, very strong, and almost entirely unbalanced and unable to be balanced fairly. The only real downside this item could ever has is if the fight or dungeon you were doing went too quickly. But if that happened, then you probably didn't even need to care about optimizing your use of it, unlike our number 1 spot, which doesn't even have that kind of downside. Speaking of, and at number 1, we have Velen's Future Sight. This was a legendary trinket that could be used by all healer specializations, and it had the on-use ability that made it so all of your healing was increased by 15%, and for the duration, 50% of all your overhealing would be redistributed to up to 3 nearby injured allies for 10 seconds. This was the strongest healing legendary by far, as well as the strongest legendary in the game. There were very few actual abilities in the game that had healing increases as strong as this legendary. But add on top of that the absurdly low cooldown of only 1 minute and 15 seconds, it was almost never worth it to hit any cooldown along this trinket since it was just so powerful and could be used all the time. Rather than being used for emergencies, this just became your regular healing cooldown, and all of your other cooldowns were relegated to emergency duty just because of how strong it was and how little you cared about the timing when you used it. This was a literal requirement for anyone trying to do any form of endgame healing. In fact, for Restoration Druids, their own incredibly strong healing legendary Aman'thul's Wisdom went from quite powerful to frankly unbalanced alongside this one, since they both relied on overhealing. Additionally, this trinket enabled a very strong playstyle in Mythic Dungeons, where rather than a healer needing to heal and micromanage their entire group, they could instead just use this trinket and funnel heals into their tank over 10 seconds, just letting the overheal pour onto their group, keeping everyone topped off without needing to play as if your life depended on it. Of course, that's only in dungeons. In raids, this was already overpowered simply by how WoW healing tends to work, where you'll do almost 50% of your healing as overhealing, especially without smart heals, which were much less common in Legion. This just turned all of that naturally lost healing into even more healing for your group, which at the time it felt almost like cheating. This trinket was so ingrained in the meta for healing specializations that it never underwent any changes due to how much of a staple it was, as it was taken by 95% of healers that did any form of raiding or dungeons. Its absurdly low cooldown and frankly overtuned ability ended up making Velen's Future Sight easily the strongest legendary in Legion, as well as why it takes number 1 spot on this list. And that's all of the strongest Legion legendaries. If you disagree with our list, or thought any other legendary deserved a spot on this list instead, I'd love to hear about that down in comments, as well as why. Be sure to check out the twin video on this one, the top 10 worst Legion legendaries as well. Thanks to Factor75 for sponsoring today's video. Use my link to get 50% off and free shipping on your first Factor box.